customer finds valuable either overcome some pain points that they would experience without the solution. So we want to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the customers. What they say are their pains relieved or the gains derived from the offering, and we just add them here. And then we want to just prioritize them by simply dragging and dropping. The second step of the strategic advantage is identifying the differentiators, how the offering is different and better than the competitive offerings. Different and better are the important words. If the offering is different in some way than the competitor's offerings, but not significantly better in the customer's eyes, then this is not an important differentiator. The third step of the strategic advantage is developing the unique value proposition. You may have heard this area referred to as unique selling proposition, proposition statement, or elevator pitch. The work we've done in the first two steps identifies the value of the offering, and the key differentiators will go a long way to developing the unique value proposition. When working through this exercise, the best practice is to think about the primary competitor. Last, we want to put it all together in a position statement. So if you want to know any more about what's new to the blueprint, as you can see, there's a bunch of new features, please feel free to join our upcoming preview webinar, December 21st, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m., or December 22nd, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Details will be sent out via our discussion forums, and that concludes my brief overview of the new strategic advantage section of the blueprint. Thank you all for having me, and with that said, I'm going to pass it back.
Thank you very much, Joe. Appreciate that. And take me just a second to get back to where I'm used to. All right. So first of all, for those that may have joined the call a little bit late, if you have not provided me your name to this point, please go ahead and send me an email with your name and let me know that you were on the call, and I'll make sure to put it down. This is Ben Keller with Home Office. My email address is bkeller@thealternativeboard.com. All right, so let's get on with our presentation. First, I'd like to introduce both PJ Timmons and Bob Hodem, who will be our featured guests today to help us talk about strategic differentiation. Bob and PJ, I'd like each of you just to take a brief moment and provide a little overview, background of who you are and what makes this topic special for you. So Bob, why don't you go first?
Well, thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate that. Yes, Bob Hodem here. I am a TBO in southwestern Ohio, the Miami Valley, where the great and the small little Miami Valley, Miami rivers run. This topic, I've been a tab business owner for about 3 3/4 years. I took training in March of 2014, so I'm heading for 4 years. Currently have 4 boards, if you will. This topic is sort of special to me because if you look at my career before becoming a private business owner, I spent about 20 years in selling durable goods for a company called John Deere in a variety of roles. And then I I got into the advertising agency business, predominantly direct marketing, and so did a fair amount of branding and so forth, and then subsequent to that got back into field sales coaching, predominantly, again, in the direct and print industry for about 10 years or so. So my background in history as it relates to direct marketing, branding, product business, etc., I don't know necessarily makes me the right person to be speaking today, but at the end of the day, it's something I like to do and really challenges me.
Great. I think you're a perfect person to be talking today, Bob. We'll get back to you with a couple of questions here. PJ, could you provide us a brief background for you as well?
Well, hi everybody. I'm based here in Dublin, and I'm the tab master for Ireland. So I run one board, and I have a number of people that I coach directly as well, and help a lot of our TBOs here in Ireland. My background originally, I'm an accountant, ex-PwC, would have worked in property development, investment properties, all in public companies, and then in a department store where I was for 22 years in total, but 10 years as CEO. I joined TAB just, I think, prior to Bob, so a little over 4 years ago. I'm coming up on my first anniversary of the first board this week. And I've kept most of those members. So we've worked with them, and some of my kind of stories are from those members. One of the things that's been influential for me is we also, my wife and I, tossed a coin over 30 years ago to see who'd go into business. She was the one who went into business, but I've been advising and there on the sides right through that 30-year period. And we have an optician's practice, and it's a mid-sized business. It's a small business, rather. It's got 12 employees, turns over about $2 million. But we're in the largest shopping center in the country, and we've had to struggle with this because we've got the big giants all around us, and strategic differentiation has been something that has been a daily thing we've lived for many years. So I'm not a marketing professional or expert in that regard, but I've been around for quite some time. So that's a bit of my background.
Thanks, PJ. That real-world expertise is exactly what we're looking for, and congratulations on your anniversary. Why don't we go ahead and get started with our first question? We'll direct this to PJ as well. PJ, could you please describe what you mean by business valuation proposition?
Well, you could look at value proposition from two perspectives. One is the value chain that's within a company. But you do lots of different things that add value, but lots of companies look at it in terms of the cost. What I like to think about it in terms of what's the different points of value that a customer gets. So one of the little tests could be, which is a little bit, also it's related to good product market fit. When the average salesperson can sell to the average customer with an average amount of ease, you know you've got something right when that happens, and you're making money from it. So I like to think about in terms of the customer, what are the jobs that whatever your product or service must do, what are the gains that the customer can get, and what are the pains or risks that can be avoided. And looking at that sort of how value is added is it's got to do those kind of three things. It's got to start off with the jobs first, and then the pains relieved and the gains realized.
Great, that's excellent. Bob, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I was writing very quickly here. I love the way he put that. I would only reinforce the fact that this is kind of how the customer sees you, at least from my point of view. It's unique, if you will, in terms of what you may offer versus some other competitors. Of course, when we get into differentiators in a minute, we can kind of compare and contrast in that regard. And it's something that to me is that can be either quantified or can be quantified on a dollar and cent basis, or something that can be quantified on an emotional basis, if you will. The example I would use is that I happen to own a Mercedes-Benz, and I bought it used, so don't get too carried away on how profitable this business may be. But at this point in time, the unique selling position for me with Mercedes-Benz is when I sit in that seat, it feels really good. And I've sat in a lot of luxury car seats, but this particular one felt the best. And so for me, the details in the cabin of the Mercedes-Benz just fits me very nicely. And I think of Mercedes-Benz from that internal cabin and unique selling position that they have.
That's a great example. Often it's just how we feel about something rather than, a lot of the facts. But what you described with Mercedes is a combination of both. It's what you feel along with the knowledge of the quality of the product that you're buying. That's great. So Bob, you mentioned it. Could you please describe what you mean by differentiation?
Well, first I look at differentiation in terms of other people that may be in the marketplace. sometimes the unique value proposition and the differentiators can be confused. I do have an example I'll give you where they kind of cross over, if you will. But the differentiator is, okay, where do you stand in your marketplace in relation to other competitors, both directly and possibly products or services that could be substituted in place? And how do you differentiate against those individuals to get your share of the market? The example I want to use, I have a client that's in the residential HVAC business, heating and air, and he has a unique selling a differentiator that frankly becomes a unique selling proposition as well. It's very simple. 8 to 8 at the same great rate. And if you think of HVAC folks and so forth, historically 8 to 5, and then if you want somebody to come after 5 or on an emergency basis, then it's a higher rate, etc. And he was able to differentiate himself relatively quickly because what he did was he brought in half of his crew starting at 8 in the morning and working until 5 in the afternoon, and then the other half of the crew that came in at 11 in the morning and woke up and worked till 8 o'clock at night. And subsequent to that, he didn't really necessarily pay any overtime, but he went from 8 hours or 9 hours coverage, which is traditional for most HVAC companies, to 12 hours coverage. And so that was a differentiator against competition. I remember when he dropped that bomb here, his phone was really ringing a couple of years ago. But conversely, it's a bit of a unique selling position for the customer. Oh, geez, you mean you actually come after I get home from work? So it can go both ways.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent example. And I know personally I look for small things like you just described in the companies that I do business with, just to see that they're actually thinking about me and my life and how I interact with them. PJ, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I suppose we're all familiar with the concept of our unique selling proposition, but sometimes it can be difficult to be unique. So what you can always have is, I would call it, ownership of your selling proposition. So in other words, if you rank a hierarchy of those jobs, pains, or gains that I mentioned earlier, if you rank which are the ones that you address most, but also to plot that against your competitors, and then you're going to communicate and engineer your business, maybe particularly if you are a smaller business, to be very different to the larger competitor. So the example I would have there was when we found ourselves in a shopping center with 2 other global competitors in the optical space, and they were all doing 1-hour service. We put up big posters saying, lenses you can't get in an hour. And that was all about differentiating ourselves, more premium, more higher, different level of service, health focused. So in other words, it's the lenses you can't get in an hour. We're going to be the specialist for you.
Yeah, those are both great examples. So most businesses probably think that their value propositions and differentiators are clear to the customer, but often that's not the case. So how often do you meet with a new member who has developed a clear value proposition and points of differentiation versus those that think they have that but really don't? Bob, can you go first?
Well, let me just say the 80-20 rule applies here. 80% of them don't really have that, or think that, well, my differentiator is service. Not so much. It's very difficult in this day and age, especially, to have service as a differentiator. Service is a price of entry, for lack of a better term. If you don't have good service, the whole world will know about it. If you do, the whole world won't know because they won't say anything. So it's sort of the price of entry, if you will. But remind me of the question again. I sort of got derailed there.
Sure, you're fine. So how often do you meet with a new member who has developed a clear value proposition and points of differentiation? And I guess if you could expound and kind of help us understand how you could recognize that and see that it was a strength.
Yes, exactly. Thanks for getting me back on track here. The key here is that almost none of the private businesses, and if you look at my mix in U.S. dollars, it's about, my smallest client's about 400,000, my largest is 27 million. The most of the individuals are at a location where they make an adequate living or close to adequate living and so forth, doing kind of what they've always done. And so one of the first things that we'll end up doing is saying, you say service is strong, but everybody does service. So let's begin to think about what makes you different. Often there are things that can make them different. For example, if they've been in a marketplace a long time and have a good reputation, you may try to leverage that, if you will. But more often than not, in my situation, I'm bringing businesses on that have sort of always done what they've always done, if you will, in that regard.
Right. Well, we'll dig in here in just a minute on how you help those that really don't have the strongest value proposition. So, PJ, what about you? Do you have you met with new members who have developed clear value propositions and points of differentiation?
Well, again, it's very much that 80-20 rule. The fast-growing ones have made, they've got it pretty strong. And maybe I'll give you an example of one of my members, which I can talk about. They're a Thai food takeaway, and their core focus is on health conscious, younger, affluent females with busy lives. So looking at, if I break that into the jobs they must do, they must deliver delicious, healthy food on time. And in that they will say, we deliver 40 minutes. Why is it delicious? Well, it's award-winning consistently. And why is it healthy? Because the calories and the salt levels are low, the sugar levels are low, and the calorie counts are on every single product. But that's the job it kind of must do. In terms of the benefits they deliver, well, it's convenient. So you can order on the go, you can order by app. It's more healthy because it's locally sourced, for example. It's tasty because it's highlighting the executive chefs. And the benefits they deliver also, it makes people feel, because it's aimed at younger women, they will invariably have models and celebrities creating signature dishes so that it's telling the customer, you can eat the same and look like this. So that's the kind of the benefits. And there's unexpected benefits as well, such as you get invitation to cookery classes, you can purchase ceramics to eat the products that are delivered, and the guy that delivers it actually is in a dicky bow. So there's a whole lot of, that's kind of like a rose moment that differentiates. And then the packaging is all soft and beautiful, and it's always got a backstory to it so people can read all about it, and it's got a really strong branding in it. It also then looks at how it eliminates risks. So you're not going to become fat on it because the calorie counts are there, or you can have your dish at a smaller calorie count level. And one of the key differentiators they have, which is almost invisible, they can do consistently complex product that's delivered with amazing consistency. Why? Because they do it in a centralized kitchen, and they don't let the local takeaway and such get involved in doing complex starters because it's too difficult for them. And then they have the packaging delivery to keep it all hot. So that's almost a business model that creates a lot of value, and that business is growing quite quickly.
Yeah, PJ, I think what you highlighted is really critical. Often the differentiators and the value proposition is a subset of, or a highlighted pieces of what our business model really is, and we often overlook the simplicity of that because we're trying to find these things that might project us in a way that we want to be, but aren't really consistent with who we truly are. I think that's a great example. Thanks for sharing. So now let's kind of flip the coin, PJ. When you speak with new members who think they have a strong value proposition, but it does not seem strong to you, how do you help them see that this is an area that they should work on?
Well, I try to get them to look at it from a customer's point of view. And the best way of doing that, I find, is actually to get them to coach them around getting a proper NPS score. And we actually have one of our tab members who does that for some companies, including the optical business we have. So by getting them to capture the customer's why, they're actually seeing and getting feedback based on the customer's eyes. Because the questions are, on a score of 0 to 10, what are the chances you'd recommend me to a friend or a colleague? And the second question is, why did you give it that score? So the things that come out of that are really, really powerful, because often the member does not appreciate how they're actually adding value in the customer's eyes. So what we do, for example, in the optical business is any score where there's a 6 or less, it's referred onto the managing director immediately, and it's dealt with on the day, where they actually call the customer to figure out what went wrong and to talk to them. And the idea is that you'll turn them into promoters, even though they're a detractor. Invariably, it's been some misunderstanding, but that misunderstanding can be brought back into how do you change your value prop? How do you change your procedures, the way you communicate things, to reduce those risks of creating a brand detractor, but you're adding value all the time in doing that, and you're discovering new things. For example, one of the things we discovered with one of our main competitors who does very low-priced, very cheap product, it breaks a lot. But when people come back to the stores, they actually deal with it very effectively. So establishing a benchmark score, not just for your own business, but for your close competitors, that really tells you why people come to you, but also why they go to your competitors.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Bob, did you have anything to add, or anything that you do with those members that you work with that feel that their proposition is strong or their differentiators are strong, but they're really not, from your perspective? Are you there, Bob?
Oops, I had it on mute.
Oh, that's right.
When I start working with a new client, and I determine that maybe they think they're have greater differentiators than they do, there's a guy by the name of Simon Sinek. Starts with a Y. I'm sure everybody in this call knows them. I actually take them through an exercise and say, hey, I'd like to show you a video, maybe 15 minutes long or whatever the heck you call it now. I guess it's 18 because it was a TED Talk. Then I said, I'd like you to step back your differentiator in light. And often their differentiators fall under the how or the what, not necessarily under the why. And so what that does is it tends to drive a thought process in a totally different direction in terms of, oh, so this is how customers really look at my business. And that happens over the course of three coaching. I sometimes on my initial coaching session or two, I'll do that as well. It begins to get the entrepreneur in a different manner.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I love that video. It really actually changed the way that I approached business when I first saw that. And I'm just curious. I've worked with many customers personally or clients personally who really struggled with understanding how to see things from their customer perspective. Have you, Bob, been able to help your clients, and what tools have you used to help them really start to look at their business through the eyes that their customers have?
Well, there's a variety of things. I think the net promoter that PJ talked about is one. I've done a number of surveys using SurveyMonkey, if you will, to developing a questioning set of 8 or 10 questions that get feedback, if you will, depending upon the organization. I've done a secret shopper kind of thing. I've got a client over in Columbus I just strictly coach with, and she owns a sauna and wellness organization, if you will. They've got the infrared saunas. They do massage and that sort of thing. And in her case, she thought it was all about the fact that the infrared is best and it cleanses the toxin and yada, 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 yada. And so I actually I coach a college marketing team at Ohio State, so I had a couple of the 21, 22-year-olds go in and get the treatment, et cetera. Then they came back and reported to me, and then I reported back to her and said, your client really cares about this, and you're selling that, if you will. And so she began to modify her selling style, if you will, and it seems to be lifting sales accordingly. In her case, she had a one-size-fits-all approach, and that is everybody should have everything all the time.
Right. Yep. I think those are great. I think just asking the clients or the customer base could be the easiest way. It's just so often we try to overcomplicate things like that. We're getting some questions about that Simon Sinek TED Talk. If you YouTube Simon Sinek why, you'll find that TED Talk. The title, I believe, is How Great Leaders Inspire Action. And then you can also go to Simon Sinek's website, Start With Why, and you'll find all of that information as well. So, PJ, we often hear business owners saying that their customer service is a differentiator, and we touched on this a little bit earlier. Often it is good, but not necessarily exceptional or not as good as they perceive it to be. In your experience, how can service be an effective differentiator?
Well, service really is the core of differentiation. Pretty much with every member, I ask, what products or service do you sell? And my second question is, what emotion do you sell to? They're very quick with the first answer, but not with the second one. And this comes back to my time really in selling, cosmetics. As Charles Revson said, in the factory we make cosmetics, in the department store we sell hope. So in other words, we know from a retail perspective for a long time, and the same goes for any kind of purchase decision, that decisions are made emotionally and then justified afterwards logically. So therefore, the service element is very much about what emotion is this product selling to. A bit like Bob was talking earlier about the feel of the seat in the Mercedes. There's so much emotion around why does that seat feel good, and understanding that. So, but it's not just that. It's maybe the way the initial person was treated in the showroom by the Mercedes dealer. So it's one of the things, for example, I think that Tesla has got very right, in that they didn't say it's not just about range anxiety. It's actually about the whole emotional experience of buying a Tesla. And therefore, I don't know how it's done in the States, but I know they're just here and it's kind of a revolution. But it's a whole experience. It's not kind of some sort of smooth fella asking you, trying to diagnose some pains. They bring you through a complete experience that's pretty awesome. And that's part of this service thing and how you define that. So we discovered, for example, in the optical business, that the no rush, we never advertised a no rush service, but people didn't feel pressurized to the same extent as they did in other businesses. We still can get the upsell, but we know we've got to build trust first, and this is about creating a lifetime of trust. So for example, when we do repairs, the money just goes into the charity box, for example. And it's a whole aspect about the whole experience, and the experience that people get is, you could talk about that customer journey as we would in retail, and the customer journey starts maybe at about where they experience your product, maybe online, or somebody else telling them about it, whatever it is. So service is absolutely a critical differentiator that makes, that is really so important.
Thanks. I'll be honest, I actually just had a technical issue and I dropped out of the meeting, so I only heard part of your answer, PJ, but I'm back. And I'll trust that what you said was phenomenal, because everything else you said has been.
Okay.
So I'm having a little technical issue right here. I'm sorry, my computer shut down, joined me, so I just got back in. I missed most of what PJ said, but I'll trust that it was phenomenal. And I'll turn it over to Bob and ask Bob the same question. So, Bob, in your experience, what is it that you can do to help a business or a member see that service can be a differentiator?
Okay. I would agree with PJ in that regard. I think, however, a lot of times the new prospects or the new clients I work with say service because they can't think of anything else. I'd like to go back many years and give you an example of how you identify yourself to your client, if you will, in terms of that. And years ago, there was a company that I worked for called John Deere that started bringing out lawn tractors for first-time homeowners and stuff. And John Deere dealerships would start selling those, and they didn't like selling them because, they had spent a lot of time, et cetera. And I had a John Deere dealer recognize very early on that he could sell a lot of these to first-time home buyers. So what's a first-time home buyer look like? They come in, that's husband and wife, 2 young children. When I say young children, probably one's 3 or 4 years old sitting on your tractors, and the other one's probably in mom's arms. Now, the average individual, the average John Deere dealer at that point in time wanted to start at the back and go all the way to the front and use the same selling technique, if you will, to sell the lawn tractors you would a large $50,000 agricultural tractor. Didn't work very well. And I had a dealer recognize relatively early on, and you talk about the emotion, he would normally sit the individual on the seat. It had a high back seat. Now, doesn't that feel good? Yes, it does. Oh, by the way, if your children happen to be out in the yard, and for some reason they get too close, there's an automatic kill switch. All you have to do is raise up off the seat. Mom liked that. Thirdly, it's made with the same quality that John Deere large tractors have been made for well over 150 years. Normally, the buyer either had an uncle or a father or a neighbor that owned John Deere, so he wanted a John Deere. So he identified the brand. And then back to the service element, the fourth element he'd say is, look, we'll give you the same quick machine down service. Should something happen to this tractor, it has the same warranty as our larger tractors. And he would sell it right then, and it would only take him 5 to 10 minutes to sell this $1,500 tractor. So he used service in this, that particular dealer used service in that situation to say, we have high-quality service because of the work we do with our construction and our agricultural equipment, and so we leverage that right into the $1,500 product. At that point in time, service did become a differentiator.
Yeah, I think both the example of Tesla as well as the example of John Deere are great examples of how service can really make a difference. So, Bob, when a member says that lowest price is their differentiator, how do you respond to that?
I actually had somebody tell me that, and I said, well, it's good to know because I have to go, I'll have to start marketing for a new member. And he went, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, I want to work with you to chase value, not chase price. Because if price is your only differentiator, you can only go so low unless you're independently wealthy and you just were trying to drive some sort of market share or something. Because if you cannot sell the value, it's just like a business owner. If we get hung up on the price and can't sell the value, then our likelihood of getting a customer and, more importantly, retaining them isn't as good, if you will. Unfortunately, many people, in fact, now is a good time. I'm going to digress here a bit, but now is a good time for some of those clients that say, boy, I don't have some of your customers that don't have necessarily the right client base. I'm actually working with a company now that's in the gear cutting business, and he's chased all kinds of business just to drive his cash flow over time, but now he has the ability to begin raising his price. He works in the aerospace industry. And at that point in time, I said, well, let's look at those customers, because what you'll find is that customer that gives you 2 cents worth of margin takes 50 amounts of time, and the company that gives you 40 cents worth of margin. So let's take a time now. Let's consider replacing them with better valued customers for us, and begin firing those customers. He said, well, how do you fire a customer? I said, well, I'll just begin to raise the price. And invariably, in fact, one of them is a company called Honeywell that just did a 5-year new contract with him, predominantly do specialty items in the military industry. And he raised the price 38% on the new 5-year contract, and they didn't even bat an eye. And so he said, well, I always thought it was all about price. I said, yeah, but your differentiator in the marketplace is that you'll cut 5 or 10 gears at a time. The low price sellers will want to cut 100,000 at a time and do it in China. So until he realized that, and so, like I said, he basically picked up 38 points of margin on a product that was getting 7 or 8 points of margin, if you will. So don't sell price, sell value.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. How about you, PJ? How do you approach it when your member says that low price is their differentiator?
To be honest, it rarely exists. Where I would maybe have more of a challenge is with people saying our prices are keen, which means they're not necessarily the lowest, but they match maybe a low competitor in the same price. And I tell them that even is a problem because invariably that player is either somebody in trouble. So how do they compete against somebody who's going bust? In other words, they can never race to the bottom, and they've got to think, as Bob has talked about, they've got to think about value. How do they improve their value? So I would ask them things like, well, who's the market leaders in terms of profitability in their sector? What do they charge? So what are they selling that's so different? So it depends where they are in the sector, but I would always say that, if you're going to go for a low price, you've got to have the most competitive, sustainable low prices, and you can take all the bumps that come with that of people going bust, undercutting you, because you've got the lowest cost inputs on the other side. And we would have had that very much with a small supermarket group here in Ireland. When it heard that Walmart was coming in, it said, look, we know that there's a 10% differential on branded products between what Walmart buy them for and what we buy them for. We've never made 10% bottom line ever. So the family, and it was a second generation family business, the decision was to sell, because they just could not make profits in the longer term. So people can never compete at that lower level unless they're the number one in the marketplace. There's room for one person to do it only.
Sure. Well, let's bring it a little closer to home, and Bob kind of touched on this, but PJ, how would you address this with a TBO who is charging lower dues than maybe is really appropriate because they feel like they need to provide that low price edge versus the competition?
I don't think I've had this low versus competition. I've had low because people want to attract somebody onto a board to make the board full, and that person is adding some value to the board. So that's a judgment call for them if the individual doesn't have the money. In other words, they're providing value in some other way, but we don't tend to have this kind of discounting against it, in that there's not, I think we sufficiently believe in our own product that there's nothing really that compares with us. And in fact, if you think about what do we compare against, it's probably against high price consultancy. But then we're in a longer game, so it's about having and retaining membership over a longer time.
Sure. What about you, Bob? How do you address that when you talk to other TBOs who might be lowering their price just to attract members?
Pricing, I don't care if it's a product or service, whatever the case may be, is always an interesting exercise. In my case, I'm like PJ. I don't run into, there are Vistage in the market and so forth here, but I don't run into them. My biggest competitor is something called status quo. And that is, sure, these prospects have never done anything like this before, and they've gotten to where they've gotten to, and it didn't cost them $550 or $650 a month. So why should we participate in that regard? And that's where you have to sell the value and understand that this gig is not for everybody in terms of prospects and customers. And so the other thing I would say, and I'm a big proponent of this, I guess, having coached field sales teams on and off most of my life, make sure you have a broad and deep enough funnel. Often you don't have a broad and deep enough funnel, and so therefore, boy, I've only got 3 prospects and I got 2 seats to fill. I bet that means I have to have a 2/3 conversion rate. My conversion rate is somewhere around 20-21%. So you've got to have a deeper and broader funnel so that you can pick those particular clients that are probably best fit. Now, that's a hell of a lot easier for me to say at the 3 3/4 year mark than it was at the 3/4 year mark. But even in that situation, there are probably some clients that I signed up that I knew in the long term, but I had to at least begin generating revenue and in terms of the business plan and so forth. But I will say that, like PJ, of the 5 that I signed up in my first month, 4 of them are still with me. So that's 39, 40, 42 months, 43 months ago.
Yeah.
So, but realize broad and deep funnel, and you can't, and by discounting, you don't necessarily win the race.
Yeah, I think that last thing you just said is really valuable. Discounting does not really help you win the long-term race. Great point. So, Bob, sometimes members have not taken the time to clearly or formally understand the value of their offerings to their customers. How do you help them to better understand value from the customer's perspective beyond, surveys as we talked about before? This is really looking at how their product or service really benefits the customer.
Well, let me give you an example, which actually was thought of by the client. I have a client that does rental, and they rent small skid steer loaders, lifts, all that kind of thing. It would tend to go toward the small to mid-sized contractor, landscapers, and even homeowners in that regard. And he was struggling a bit with pricing. He wanted to raise pricing, but he didn't feel he could. He thought there were too many competitors in the marketplace. So for about 4 Saturday mornings in a row, and he has a general manager running the place, he just stood in the showroom and had conversation. Well, how did that rental go? Or why did you choose me? Or whatever the case may be. Well, first of all, he got to know about 55 or 60 customers face to face, which was great. And secondly, he learned that, wasn't, in his case, it wasn't all, and he said, well, did you come here because I had the best price? He said, no, I came here because you were convenient. I came here because you've been here for 35 years and have a great reputation. I came here because I know when I pick up a piece of equipment from your location, you do a good job of showing me how to run it correctly, and it is a quality piece of equipment that I don't have to worry about breaking down when I go home. Now notice there was nothing mentioned about price at all. So at that point in time, basically across the board 2 seasons ago, last season, at the end of last season, he raised most of his pricing by 10 to 12%. This year, his total rentals, and it has to do with the marketplace, his total rentals are up almost 40%. He'll probably rent about $1.7 million in equipment this year, compared to about $1.1 million last year, $1.2 million, something like that. So him recognizing that the reason, it had nothing to do with price. In his mind, it was all about price. Yeah. But he's a high C, so it would be. Yeah. In that regard. So, but in his case, he realized reputation, convenience, high quality product, tremendous. Now we're back to service. Okay, so to some degree I'm refuting what I said earlier, but back to service. They show me how to use the product, and if I have a problem, you have a phone number I can call and put somebody on that will show me or kind of help educate me, if you will. So there's 5 differentiators ahead of price.
Right, and I think the example that you provide, Bob, really highlights sometimes the best way to learn something is to just ask a question. And we don't do that very often. And, standing in the middle of the showroom and talking to the customers is just a phenomenal way to build great rapport and to get a lot of good information. I think that's excellent. How about you, PJ? What's your approach?
A number of things. The board actually is very useful. So I get people to bring challenges like that to the board. So, for example, we had that member in the fast food area who was hell-bent on he was not going to use Deliveroo as a distribution mechanism for his product because they had their own app and everything. And I really encouraged him to bring it to the board. And the board more or less said, you got to go on Deliveroo. That's where everybody's at. And it was really the power of the board because he actually turned on Deliveroo. One member said, why would you have a hotel and not have it on hotels.com? And that was almost the trigger moment for him. So he ended up putting his UK store on that, and business pretty much doubled overnight. So the board is very important. In my coaching, I keep asking people about the segments to further segment. And you can segment on the basis of disc, or you can segment on the basis of socioeconomic or some other forms. And I think by getting them, they don't actually segment their customer base that much. They want to jump to quick conclusions. Whereas if you have segmented your customer offering, that actually brings out much more richness about the value proposition, because they understand they give different value to different people. So, for example, one of the first things, this is going back way many years, when we put in the first IT systems into the optical business, we were able to segment every female between the ages of 18 and 24 who had purchased contact lenses in the previous 6 months, offer them colored contact lenses at Halloween, and I think we had something like a 20% sell-through rate. So by segmenting customers, you can appreciate the different value proposition that you have for each one of them. Again, meeting the customers is very important. So that individual in the fast food business actually does a delivery at least once a month himself. So he goes out and he meets the customer, and he's reasonably well-known bloke. Sometimes people know him and sometimes they don't. But he picks up a huge wealth of information by actually doing that. Another one we encourage our members to do is track the new customers and to really almost do a new customer survey. So to identify how they found out about them, why did they really come, where were they before, what was the reason for the change. And again, they learn new things about their value proposition. So we would have had that, historically we would have, in the retail business where we're asking in a furnishing chain, we had, why did people come to us? And convenience was the first answer. But what we discovered after some time, that convenience was the logical answer, but it wasn't the emotional answer. The emotional answer needed to dig deep, a little bit deeper into it. So in the optical business, we do that because there's 3 other opticians in the same shopping center. And so we actually discover more in the conversation and try and capture the real reasons why people come. And a lot of it is around trust. I wouldn't trust a corporate to take care of me type of thing, whereas I will trust somebody who's been on the ground there for so many years, that type of thing. So it's to encourage them to dig further, to really understand with each of the segments. That would be that's the kind of way I work it with them.
Sure, yeah, makes sense. So you mentioned bringing it to the board, bringing challenges like this to the board and letting the board kind of provide that feedback. What other exercises or approaches have you used to help members define a clear value proposition? PJ?
Well, I go through an exercise with them of actually working out the pains and gains and jobs, and plotting that for different customer segments. So the first step is to identify the customer segment, then is to identify the main jobs, and understanding that those jobs could be the transactional job, but it also may be an emotional job. So, if we just wanted to get from A to B, we'd all buy Model Ts. But because we've very much different emotional jobs of our self-actualization and things like that, so you've got to understand, what the product it has to do, must do. Then the pains and the gains, and keep brainstorming all of those out for each customer segment, and keep going through each customer segment, and to get lots of different things around that. Then by putting an X on which are the ones that they really excel on versus their competitor. So then that starts to drive out the value proposition. And I often have to find to do this, a member has a great new idea. And the thing is, the idea is probably a little bit bonkers, but they have to discover that themselves. And that's where we kind of go through this exercise, and how is it different, and how are they going to actually make money on it. But by looking at all the different customer segments, and then where will they start off? Where is the biggest wins? Where's the low-hanging fruit? How can they prove it? So rather than them spending a lot of money, sometimes members have come to us because they've previously lost a lot of money on making a mistake, and they want to have it more thoroughly tested. So actually, if I really go into a lot of detail on this, I will actually go into the value proposition design. It's a tool that's online. You can use it free for 30 days with a member. If you've got a unique email, and just working through the process. So I have all the books on value proposition design, how to do it. So we'll work through that process with somebody if they really want to go into a lot of detail around it.
Sure. Yeah. It can become very. There's a lot to sift through when you go through this kind of an exercise, and having a tool like that can be very helpful. How about you, Bob? How do you approach helping members to define a clear value proposition?
Well, it's actually part of part as I go through when I talk about the business vision, if you will, in that scenario, and we look at it in terms of how long do you want the business to last. Like I have a client, for example, right now that joined us about 6 months ago. He happens to be an attorney, and he focuses in on automobile accidents, predominantly with commercial carriers. He's 50 years old, and part of the reason he joined the board is because he's not convinced that he will have a viable business model in 10 years. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, well, look at all the braking and self-driving cars and all that kind of stuff that will be happening. And so he says, I don't think I'll have a business to sell in 10 years because traffic accidents will be a thing of the past. Well, he was being a bit facetious when he said that. But at least he recognized there might be some changes. And so we looked at the ancillary businesses. Obviously he did not want to get into divorce law and estate settlement and that kind of stuff. But what we have found is that, in fact, he was looking predominantly, most of his work had been done has been done predominantly in the private automobile accident realm, if you will. And he has a way of generating leads and stuff, but he's begun to move over into what I would refer to as the motor carrier side of it, long-haul trucks, short-haul trucks, city delivery trucks, that sort of thing. And actually has brought on a couple of regional carriers here, and any time there's an automobile accident or a truck gets, because you can imagine a 18-wheeler semi gets into an accident on the interstate, there's a lot of damage done till that baby gets stopped. And so he's kind of moved into that scenario where, at least during his lifetime, we don't perceive that the quote-unquote self-driving truck will be into play. So even though there is some of that going on, you'll still need a driver or a number of drivers just because of the laws necessary about how long someone can be in a cab and all that sort of stuff. And so he's begun to move into that segment of the business, and frankly, that one may well be more profitable for him because unlike the other side of the business where he was working with private accidents, he's having to resell his services all the time because, unless I get rear-ended once a week, I'm not a repetitive customer with him. The carriers, the couple of carriers they've brought on thus far are giving him 2 or 3 accidents a month. So just by looking at, segmentation like PJ mentioned and saying, okay, here's my core competency, how can I complement the business with that core competency? And so that's when we started moving into private carriers.
Sure. Yeah, that's excellent. So I want to acknowledge that we're coming to the bottom of the hour. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. And so final question for both of you. We'll start with Bob. Just as a wrap-up, do you have any other best practices that come to mind about coaching members to create a stronger value proposition or points of differentiation?
I wouldn't say as it relates to technique. I am a bit sensitive to time. And that is, look, every 6 months or a year. In fact, we're coming up. I have day-long meetings in January where we present one another's business plans to the other board members. And I urge them at the end of the year to say, okay, how has our business changed? What's going on that may drive the viability and the value of this business going long term, if you will? And so I don't necessarily have any other techniques, but it's all about the repetitiveness, the frequency, the importance to consistently be looking, if you will, in that regard.
Absolutely. The look back and the look ahead, I think, are absolutely critical, especially when you include the topic of your unique value proposition and how you differentiate in the market. I think that's excellent. PJ, how about you? Any final thoughts or best practices you'd like to share?
Well, again, I have a board meeting in the morning, and all the members are putting their look back, their look forward. What I'll be asking the board members to do is to kind of road test that in terms of, is this ambitious enough? Is it differentiated enough? What are the threats maybe coming down the road or the opportunities? And it's really just using the board to develop this value proposition for our members. Sure, we can help in our one-to-one coaching by using the tools. And I'm a great believer in the NPS system when applied properly, which is the proper benchmarks across your competitors, and then continuously doing it on all your transactions. It's just so powerful at helping you differentiate.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. Well, we are at the bottom of the hour. I'd like to thank both Bob and PJ for sharing their wisdom and their expertise with all of us. I personally have found this to be very educational, very beneficial, and I appreciate your willingness to share your ideas with us. So thank you both, Bob and PJ, for being our guests today. Thank you also to everybody who has been on the call and for your patience with those technical issues. We will forward these recordings on to Dave, and he will make them available as he normally does. If you joined the call and did not provide me your name, please email me, bkeller@thealternativeboard.com, and let me know that you were on the call, and I'll add you to the list. With that, I hope you all have a fantastic Monday. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Happy holidays to all.
Bye-bye.
Happy holidays. Christmas. Bye.